My undergraduate work was done at Hadrian and Bryn Mawr, my graduate work at Columbia. For the last 25 years, I've been co-director of the excavations at Troy in northwestern Turkey, and since 2007, co-director of the excavations at Gordian in central Turkey, very close to Ankara, which have been conducted under the auspices of the Penn Museum since 1950. I also have the honor of being a trustee of the American Academy in Rome and a board member of the American-Italy Society of Philadelphia, whose mission is to promote in Philadelphia the knowledge of Italian art, music, language, and culture. So this lecture is sponsored under the auspices of both the Penn Museum and the America-Italy Society, so I look forward to seeing all of you at the program sponsored by both organizations in the course of the coming year. As I put this together, I realized that I would not be able to touch on everyone's favorite new discovery associated with Rome. Now, many of these new discoveries are in the city of Rome itself. Many are in the Roman world per se, so around the Mediterranean. What I found as I put it together is that it would be easiest to concentrate on Italy and Turkey in the course of this lecture, and on the empire rather than the republic, although I will start with the republic. The connections between America and Rome recently have been stressed repeatedly. In 2003, with the beginning of the Iraq campaign, there were critics of the campaign who began to ask whether or not America had begun to resemble a revived ancient Roman Empire, whether or not America was creating an empire analogous to that of Rome. And one began to hear an increasing number of voices to this effect throughout the US, culminating in the publication of a book called Are We Rome?, comparing the Roman Empire with what the author thought was the American Empire. And this gave rise to additional critics who wrote a follow-up book, Why America is Not a New Rome. And so we found people on both sides of the statement over the course of the last decade. But what's most important is that people are now seeing America in ancient Roman terms. Not just in ancient Roman terms, but also in ancient Trojan terms. If you look at some of the publications of the modern wars, and you look at the titles that have been used to try to make sense of those wars, you see titles such as Odysseus in America, Achilles in Vietnam, Ajax in Iraq. The links between antiquity and the modern period have never been stronger, and I'll emphasize a number of those as we go through the slides. So with new discoveries, I won't focus only on those that have been made in the last 5 years. Some of these discoveries that I'll mention to you were made as long ago as 20 years ago. But the discoveries have still not made their way into modern scholarship, and so you may not be familiar with them. Let me start off in Rome, in the Roman Forum itself, which is a monument or an area with which you're all familiar. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, there were a series of core samples that were done in the Forum. That means drilling. This isn't in the Forum, but this gives you an idea of what's involved. Drilling into the Forum itself, looking at the kind of material that comes up from the cores that are pulled up out of the ground, seeing what datable material there is in connection with the cores, and trying to reconstruct changes in the landscape over time. And as a result of doing that, we've been able to determine that at the end of the 7th century BC, or very beginning of the 6th century BC, during the reign of the king Tarquinius Priscus, who ruled, as you see, from 616 to 579, there was a major public works project in the Roman Forum that we never had understood until this core sampling took place. There, at this point in the late 7th century, there hadn't been any monumental building in the Roman Forum for the simple reason that it flooded so frequently, because the Tiber River, of course, is just to the side. And so what was done at the end of the 7th century, presumably during the reign of Tarquinius Priscus, was to raise the ground level of the Forum 2 meters higher, so over 7 feet higher, in order to raise it above the level that would be affected by the floods of the Tiber on an annual basis. Please feel free to come in. There are plenty of chairs in the center. Oh, okay. Well, you're free to do that as well. She's here. So in order to do that, in order to lift the Forum up 2 meters. What they did, the engineers who were responsible for this, is to bring in 20,000 cubic meters of earth, filling the area with 20,000 cubic meters of earth and lifting it up 2 meters. Now that's a phenomenal public works project that would have involved thousands of laborers. It would, of course, have involved a great number of carts, tools for moving the earth, and road systems. I mean, you can hardly get your mind around all the infrastructure that would have been necessary. So trees would have to have been cut, ropes would have to have been made, metal would have to have been fabricated. It's a whole infrastructure for what had been, what was up to that point, the most important public works project that the city had ever seen. So this is something, again, that's relatively new. And it ties into the Roman historian statements about the phenomenal building activity that they had heard about occurring during the reign of Tarquinius Priscus. So we used to take all of these later historian statements about the massive construction in early Rome with a grain of salt. It seemed unlikely that there could be that much construction so early. But as a result of the core sampling of the Roman Forum, we've been able to determine that those ancient historians, even though they're writing 500, 600 years later, weren't so far off the mark. With that, we move into the late Republic and into the Empire, and with another very interesting discovery, which will take us to Greece. As you know, in the 1st century BC, there was, in essence, a century of foreign and domestic wars. So wars all over the Mediterranean, wars against Mithridates Pontus, the king of the Black Sea, wars in North Africa, wars in Europe, literally all over the Mediterranean and Europe. During this period, there were a series of oligarchies, small groups of men who ruled what was considered the Roman world. And the second of these groups, the second triumvirate, which lasted for 10 years, involved Octavian, who would later acquire the name Augustus, a man named Lepidus, and of course, Mark Antony. And you see Mark Antony here on a coin struck with his consort Cleopatra. And some of you are probably saying, well, he doesn't look like Richard Burton in that 1963 movie about Elizabeth Taylor. And he didn't. He was allegedly roguishly handsome, but you wouldn't know it from his coin. And you're also saying, gee, Cleopatra doesn't look like Elizabeth Taylor either. And she doesn't. She was not renowned for her beauty. She was renowned for her wit, her intelligence, her poise, rather than physical pulchritude. Toward the end of the 30s BC, there was a significant war between Rome and Egypt, and in particular between Octavian, who again would become Augustus, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. That battle was fought at Actium, in what is now northwestern Greece. And at the site of the victory, Octavian's victory over Antony and Cleopatra, where both of them were killed, there was a major victory monument that was erected. Now, this is not so new, although some of you may not be familiar with it. A giant victory monument at the site where the battle occurred, and this is there's a long tradition for doing these kinds of things in the Roman world. When Pompey, in the 1st century BC, mid-1st century BC, was victorious over the Spanish tribes around the area of the Pyrenees, he built a giant trophy in the middle of the Pyrenees commemorating Roman conquest of Spain, and Augustus did the same thing in southeastern France, in Provence, right next to Monaco. This is a monument that is right, this is a sort of ghoulish reference, but it's right at the turn where Princess Grace of Monaco drove off the cliff. It's right there. A giant trophy commemorating Roman victory over the Gallic tribes in the early Augustan period. And so at the site of the Battle of Actium, we have a giant monument dedicated, as you see, to Neptune and also to Mars, and the bronze ship beaks from the the navy rather, of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, from the Egyptian navy. These beaks were inserted into the foundations of the monument so that everyone was clear that this was a maritime victory. Now, and this is not one of those ship beaks. We don't have them surviving anymore from Actium. They've been melted down long ago, but this gives you an idea of what these beaks would have looked like. This was a discovery off the coast of Israel several years ago, dating several centuries earlier than these, but fundamentally of the same type. Now, next to this monument was discovered an altar, and the altar is still only in part published, just scattered references here and there, but a triumphal monument not unlike the altar of peace in many respects that was built in Rome between 13 and 9 BC. So a victory monument with two zones of sculpture. The lower zone consisting of a whole pile of armor and weapons that were used by the Egyptian army and the Egyptian navy. This was an old Roman tradition to take the weapons, the arms of your enemy, to put them in a big pile on the battlefield, and then to have a celebration following the victory over your opponent. And so they would translate that practice into stone with these giant friezes of weapons. Weapons looking as if they've been organized in a great pile. And above it is Octavian's triumphal procession in 29 BC. And so you see Octavian in triumph here, riding in the chariot, and you see the detail of that chariot here. What's interesting is that he's riding with the little children of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, which no one suspected would ever have been immortalized in the relief sculpture of a triumphal monument like this one, even though we know that Augustus welcomed the children of Mark Antony and Cleopatra as his own, and they were raised in the imperial court. But this is a development that we wouldn't have expected. On the other side of the altar, we have references to Roman origins. So you see the wolf with Romulus and Remus here, and there would probably have been some reference to Aeneas, the Trojan founder of the Roman people. So again, this is not really published yet. It's just the occasional article here and there, many of which are in festschrifts, some special birthday volumes that you don't initially see, but it's one of the major discoveries of the last few years. Now, some of the most important discoveries, not just in Rome, but also in Athens and Istanbul, are made when people start to expand their subway systems. Digging for the subway in those three cities has always been treacherous because no matter where you dig, you're going to make a major discovery. So it's wonderful for us because we get to publish major discoveries, but it's horrible for the engineers and the sponsors of the new transit systems because they have to stop while the archaeologists do their explorations, which some might say we do slowly, but one does need to document everything meticulously, since in many cases it's going to disappear once the documentation and the analysis is complete as the new subway system goes in. Now, one of the most interesting, at least in Rome, discoveries in association with the digging there too, but this one is more recent, digging of the subway system, occurred last year. So this is 2014, modification of the subway system at St. John Lateran, San Giovanni in Laterano, which you see in aerial view here. And as the digging was going on for the new subway station, they found a giant reservoir, a giant water reservoir. You see that during the process of excavation here, dating to the early 1st century AD. This was giant, 115 feet by 230 feet. You see it here in a kind of aerial view from the 1st century AD, and here in reconstructed form. This would have contained 1 million gallons of water to supply water to furnish irrigation for the surrounding fields, because this was all farmland in the early 1st century AD. So in digging down 65 feet, this pool began to take shape. It was coated in hydraulic plaster, so everyone knew from the very beginning that it was a giant reservoir. And in association with it were found pitchforks, storage baskets made of willow branches, a whole range of elements that derive from water wheels, which would have helped propel the water through channels into the surrounding farmland, and a great number of peach pits. Clearly, peach trees were one of the crops that were grown here. So with such a fundamentally important discovery, I suspect the subway station will be moved to the side because we never had found an irrigation system this monumental before in the city of Rome. We are in the early empire, and this is not a discovery that was made yesterday. It was made in the 1980s, but I was one of the people who made it, so I brought it in. With this, we move a little further in time from where we have been. We've been in the Augustan period. Augustus would die in 14 AD, ushering in the Julio-Claudian period, the period of his successors, which would last from 14 AD to Nero's suicide in 68 AD. And during that period, we witnessed the construction of a major monument in Aphrodisias, located here in what is now southwestern Turkey, that was intended to celebrate the cult of the emperors, the rulers as gods, in their own complex. Now, if I show you where we are, this is an aerial view of Aphrodisias, the theater, and in this clump of poplar trees is where we found it. And this is what we found. It's always interesting. People always say, how do you know where to dig? And a lot of times we know where to dig because we use remote sensing techniques, magnetic prospection, tools that will measure variations in the magnetic fields of buried objects, or radar, or something called electric resistivity, which will shoot electric charges, electric waves down into the earth, and they bounce back at different speeds. So you can determine whether or not something is actually in a particular area. In this case, we know of it only because the excavation house was right next to this area. This wall that you see here is part of the excavation house compound. And the telephone broke, and the repair person came to dig a hole for a new telephone pole. And in digging it, he began to find fragments of life-size marble reliefs of the early Roman emperors and the gods whom they worshipped. This was next to our toilets. So the toilets were then moved, as you can understand, and then the wall was moved in the excavation compound. And what we finally found was a 100-meter long, that's 350 feet long complex dedicated to the Roman emperors as gods. So you see it in its current state. The first, second, and third parts of the third floor have been reconstructed. So it's our best preserved sanctuary of the Roman Imperial cult. And this gives you a line drawing, an axonometric line drawing of what it would have looked like as you were coming in from the marketplace. You would have come through this elaborate and theatrical propylon or gateway into a courtyard that was flanked on both sides by 3-story porticos, one of which you see here, with reliefs set between the columns of those porticos, leading to a temple dedicated to the cult of the emperors. Augustus, his successor Tiberius, Augustus' wife Livia, and so on. We call this a Sebasteum because the word for Augustus in Greek was Sebastos, so a building dedicated to Augustus and his successors is called a Sebasteum. And I only showed you 4 reliefs that we excavated, 2 from the mythological level and 2 from the imperial level. If you want to tie together Asia Minor, now modern Turkey, and Rome, the easiest way to do it is through the Trojan War, because Aeneas, the noble Trojan hero, who was regarded as the founder of the Roman people, had escaped the burning city of Troy prior to its destruction and gradually made his way to central Italy. So if you're going to tell the story of Aeneas leaving what is now Turkey and going to what is now the area of Rome, you need a Trojan cycle. And that's what they gave us. So you see here Leda and the swan, Zeus taking the form of a swan in order to have sexual relations with Leda. So you see the wing of the swan, the body of the swan, the webbed foot of the swan, tightly clutching Leda's thigh. She bends her body in a state of tremendous passion and devotion, and her son Cupid, also winged, bends his knees in the same note of passion and great emotion. And since Leda had sexual relations with a bird, several months later she laid an egg, as one would imagine would happen, and from that egg came Helen of Troy, who would set, as a child, who would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the Trojan War and cause Aeneas, who you see here, dressed as a modern Roman general, to leave the city of Troy, accompanied by his father Anchises and his son Ascanius, and protected by Aphrodite, to leave the city of Troy and gradually make their way to Rome. The emperors are represented here too. You see the Emperor Claudius ruling from 41 to 54 AD, vanquishing the personification of Britain, which was the great triumph of Claudius. She's presented as an Amazon, as you see, with one breast covered and one breast free. And then Claudius's adopted son Nero at his accession, being crowned emperor by his mother, Agrippina, who holds a long cornucopia, a horn of plenty, to demonstrate her fecundity, her fertility. And so we found altogether about 150 reliefs, 150 life-size marble reliefs of the Roman emperors. Now with this we move into the 2nd century AD, but we continue with new discoveries in sculpture, especially new discoveries in sculpture associated with the Imperial family. As you know, the Julio-Claudian family wasn't all good. There were some bad ones. So that would include Caligula, who reigned for 4 years from 37 to 41, and Nero, who was hardly at the top of the heap, who reigned from 54 to his suicide in 68. And subsequently, there were some bad emperors as well. Domitian being a case in point, and many of you know in the Roman gallery upstairs, the giant relief of Domitian that has his name battered after his assassination in 96 AD. But after Domitian's assassination, there were 5 good emperors, 5 good ones, all in a row, from Nerva, starting in 96, until the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180. And at that point, we move into Commodus and some problematic characters again. But for nearly a century, they were all good. And this is the 3rd of those 5 good emperors, Hadrian, a bronze portrait of Hadrian that was found in 1975 at Beth Shan in northern Israel, which was excavated by this museum. Not all of it, but a good bit of Beth Shan excavated by this museum. And as you see, he's dressed as a soldier with a battle scene on the cuirass. Some would interpret this battle scene as representing Aeneas in Italy fighting the local Italic chief Turnus, about which Virgil wrote so movingly in the Aeneid. As we moved into the reign of Hadrian, there were 2 monuments in Rome that I wanted to highlight, or at least 2 discoveries that I wanted to highlight. One involving the Pantheon, which relates to a Penn professor, and the other, again, dealing with subway excavation. So first, the Pantheon, located in the Campus Martius. This is the 3rd of 3 pantheons that were built at this site. The first by Augustus and his lieutenant Agrippa in 25 BC, then built again by Domitian after a fire in the 80s AD. Then that burned down, and this is the 3rd of them, built by Hadrian, but maintaining the original inscription, which refers to the fact that Marcus Agrippa built it. And you see the exterior and the domed interior here. No one had given much thought to actually how the architectural elements that make up the facade were actually designed and carved. It's not a question or a series of questions that archaeologists had typically asked. It was assumed that somehow the marble was brought in, somehow someone had a design, and somewhere in this general area, someone would have carved the blocks that would have made up the pediment or the gable of the building. But several years ago, Lothar Hasselberger, professor in the art history department at Penn, was studying the area around the mausoleum of Augustus, which is just at the northern edge of the Campus Martius. And as he studied the pavement, he found architectural drawings on the pavement itself, as you see here, which he could link to the carving of the elements for the Pantheon. So in other words, he found the blueprints for the carving of the principal elements of the Pantheon some distance from where the Pantheon is located. So here's the Pantheon, and here's the mausoleum of Augustus. So it looks as if what happened was that the architectural elements came up the Tiber. They were unloaded here next to the mausoleum of Augustus, which was not seeing a great deal of action at that point. Hadrian was building his own mausoleum just across the Tiber from the mausoleum of Augustus. So this was free space, and the architects simply drew their plans on the pavement and then carved the elements here, and then took them down to the Pantheon and set them up here. Since that discovery, new architectural designs, new architectural blueprints have been found on pavements all over the empire, including the temple, the giant temple of Apollo at Didyma in western Turkey, which Lothar Hasselberger also found, and most recently at Aphrodisias, the architectural elements associated with subway system again. The poor Romans, you know, they really want a kind of subway system that might not rival New York, but would at least have more lines than A and B, which is all they have, 2 lines. And you can understand why they have so few lines, because digging anywhere in ancient Rome will yield thousands of years of archaeological material, and they'll have to stop. I don't know why they thought that if they dug right in the center of Rome, it would be safe for a new subway station. Mind you, I would love to have a subway station in this area. I would love it, because the nearest one is some distance away, and obviously they understood that I was one of many who would love it, and so they dug here, right next to the Victor Emmanuel monument, often referred to as the wedding cake with the typewriter. It was ultimately modeled on the great altar of Pergamon that was set up in what is now northwestern Turkey in the 2nd century BC, and then transported to Germany in 1878 and reconstructed there. It was very influential. But right in front of that building, they dug for Lineage A, for the Line C subway station. So you see it here. And as they dug down, what they found was a monument that we could tie into earlier literary references, the Athenaeum. What this was a kind of university. So rooms not unlike this one, where people would sit in bleachers and they would learn grammar, rhetoric, effective ways of speaking. It was intended to operate in conjunction with the libraries of the Forum of Trajan, which is right next door. Now, many of you are familiar with the Imperial Forum, forums built by the emperors between the time of Julius Caesar and Trajan. So in the late 1st century BC, 1st century AD, early 2nd century AD. Here's the Column of Trajan. There were libraries next door. And again, this area, we now know, but this is recent, was intended to supply the classrooms that would work in tandem with those libraries. So here you see the excavation itself, and the people who were digging it, my friend Johnny Ponte. Here's the pavement that was uncovered, a mixture of giallo antico marble. This is a red and yellow marble from quarries at Shemtu in what would now be Tunisia. And then this was bordering granite slabs. You see that in the floor here, and here are the bleachers with the sides of the bleachers still intact. So I've given you here an overview of the bleachers, of the classrooms, and the reconstruction of what we think it looked like, because a great deal of the wall decoration survives, the floor decoration survives, and all things considered, a great deal of the bleachers survive. So we can connect this to literary references and identify it as the Athenaeum of Hadrian, which is frequently discussed in the ancient literature and which was in operation for a very long period of time. Built in the early 2nd century AD, and as you see under the Emperor Theodosius II in the early 5th century, we know that on the faculty of the Athenaeum, 3 orators, 10 grammarians, 5 sophists, 1 philosopher, 2 lawyers, or jurisconsulates. So think of it as a small university using this space for the classrooms. And this is a major discovery, so major, and we even know the ancient name for it, that there cannot be a subway station here. It's just too famous overnight. So they have to find another place to put line C, but wherever they dig, there will almost certainly be another major discovery like this one. Because this was excavated so meticulously, we can see how that space functioned through time. And so what you're seeing here is a diachronic overview of how the space worked. So between the 2nd and the 5th centuries BC, it was a classroom, part of a university. In the 6th to the 7th centuries AD, new kilns, ovens were brought in, and metal ingots, and it seems to have functioned as one of the mints of medieval Rome, where coins were produced. Then, in the 7th century, later in the 7th century, it becomes a cemetery. See a grave being dug here and a body being buried in the graveyard. The mint is now out of business. No one even remembers that it was once a classroom. Then it becomes a barnyard, as we move into the 8th century. You see the cattle in the manger. And then the roof falls in the 9th century, and it's completely abandoned. So one of the nice things about these excavations for the metro stations is that really accomplished archaeologists are doing the digging, and the emphasis is not just on what happened in ancient Rome, but what happened throughout history. So these diachronic reconstructions spanning a millennium are increasingly common. I mentioned that there have been a number of unusually important sculptural discoveries associated with the 5 good emperors during the 2nd century AD. And let me show you a few of those, nearly all of which have been in Turkey. Now, we start with the site of Troy because I was fortunate enough to excavate these, and I'm the one giving you this lecture. Troy, as you know, is located at the mouth of the Hellespont or Dardanelles, linking the Aegean Sea with the Sea of Marmara, and then ultimately with the Bosphorus, which will take you into the Black Sea. This is an aerial view of the Mount of Troy, where I had the good fortune to work for 25 years. In front of the Odeon, or the Roman concert hall at Troy, I found in an earthquake collapse of about 500 AD, 2 Roman portraits. One of Augustus, who you see here, I referred to him earlier in terms of the Battle of Actium, and then yet another statue of Hadrian, who ruled the Roman Empire between 117 and 138 AD. It's not surprising to find portraits of the emperors here, because Troy was the mother city. The Romans believed that they had ultimately come from Troy. So Troy honored the emperors with portraits in the Agora or marketplace, and Rome honored Troy with exemption from taxes. Recently, a number of colossal imperial portraits have appeared at the Roman site of Sagalassos in what is now southwestern Turkey, in the district of Pisidia. So you see an overview of the theater at Sagalassos. This is a very high city. And then the Nymphaeum at Sagalassos, which has just been completely reconstructed. The 2nd century AD Nymphaeum, wherein almost all the pieces were still there. And so it could be put back up again in its original configuration. In connection with the Agora, the marketplace of Sagalassos, were a series of colossal portraits. One of 8, these were probably of all the 5 good emperors and their wives. So these, what we call Antonine dynastic ensembles, were increasingly common in the 2nd century AD in Asia Minor in particular, although one finds them all over the Mediterranean. So here's Hadrian beginning to come out of the earth. So we see the eye and the hair. Then, with a little more of the earth cleared. And when I find something like this, I send away the workmen and I dig it myself with wood, because we don't want to scratch the marble with any kind of metal implement. And this shows you the head once it had been completely excavated. Next to it was another one. This was Faustina the Elder, the wife of Antoninus Pius, the successor of Hadrian. So we're still in the 2nd century. The portrait was found upside down, so the face is still in the earth. And these are not easy to lift, but you see here the lips, here's the nose, she's being lifted up. And here you see her in the storeroom. These are all colossal. And then next to her was found a portrait of Marcus Aurelius, who was the last of the 5 good emperors and the one who succeeded Antoninus Pius and Faustina. We have less of him than we do of the others, but we have his foot with a good military sandal, his arm, he was holding a globe, and his head. And you can see in the 2nd century they started incising the pupils, and you see that very prominently here. All of these, of course, would have been elaborately painted, but unfortunately the paint itself doesn't survive. The same kinds of discoveries were made at Sardis in what is now West Central Turkey. This is an excavation conducted under the auspices of Harvard and Cornell University. And this is Crawford Greenwald Jr., who was director of the excavations at Sardis for many years, from the 70s until his untimely death a few years ago. He was a great patron of this museum and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. You see here again a colossal portrait of Faustina the Elder and a portrait of Commodus. So in the early period of Commodus, there were colossal statues of him that were made. He had turned the corner yet toward insanity. Often they would leave those portraits erect if the portraits were incredibly large and they could just change the inscription so that it looked as if somebody else was represented. So you've only got the lower part of Commodus's head, and some of you were wondering how we know it's Commodus. He had a very distinctive beard and very distinctive lips. This is not going to sound credible, but you have to trust me, it is. And so he's the end of the Antonine dynasty. And you get an idea of the size of these portraits by looking at him next to the figure of Greeny, as we called him, Robert Greenwald Jr. The construction of subway systems is not the only mechanism for monumental, astoundingly important discoveries. There are other public works projects that have done the same thing, and one of them, if I now take you to southeastern Turkey, to the site of Zeugma, on the Euphrates River, is the construction of the Ataturk Dam. This was done in the 80s and the 90s. And some of you may remember the article in the New York Times that was around 2000, where the New York Times reported that the construction of the Ataturk Dam would flood the ancient Roman town of Zeugma, sending the water, tens of meters of water, over the ancient Roman city. And thus this material may well be lost. And so what happened was that David Packard of the Packard Humanities Institute and Hewlett Packard read the New York Times article, recognized that he had only a few months before the waters of the dam inundated the ancient Roman city of Zeugma, and in the end, this is a very complex story and I'm telescoping the narrative, but in the end, he called the Minister of Culture of Turkey and said, I will give you $5 million and let's excavate this over the next 3 months, quickly, before the waters of the dam end up. And so this happened, even though the final tally was closer to 10 million. And you see that excavation in progress here, just about 15 years ago, 13, 15 years ago. When I published a sculpture from this excavation, and I did that in 2002. So the excavations were largely complete by that point. What was discovered in the course of the Zeugma rescue excavations, and those excavations still continue to an extent because not all of Zeugma was flooded, were a series of extraordinary mosaics. You see one of the mosaic floors coming out of the ground here. This is early 3rd century AD, and a closer version of it here. These are the 9 muses. Over here, you see the personifications of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. You can see in Greek, Tigris and Euphrates, both of whom have Eastern or Phrygian caps because this is an Eastern region, and both are carrying cornucopias, just as Agrippina had carried in the Aphrodisias relief to symbolize the fertility associated with the rivers. So I can't begin to tell you how many mosaics have now come out of the Zeugma excavations. Many of those are now ensconced in a brand new museum in the southeastern Turkish town of Gaziantep, called the Mosaic Museum, because it's only mosaics. But these are some of the most exquisite mosaics that have ever been found, and many of them have been found relatively recently. Those discoveries in Zeugma are often compared to the discoveries in Ephesus in west central Turkey, which have yielded elite housing from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. And these are extraordinarily well preserved. It used to be that we had to rely on Pompeii and Herculaneum for our knowledge of what wall painting, wall decoration was like during the Roman Empire. But now with the excavations at Zeugma and with the survival of these elite houses, dating created over such a long period of time, it's completely rewritten what we know about wall decoration. So you see how well it survives, although this is after a great deal of conservation work paid for by the Austrian Archaeological Institute, and thus paid for by the Austrian taxpayer, because Austrian taxes go to support archaeology the way we wish were the case in America, as it is not. But because of the vast sums of money that the Austrian Archaeological Institute pumped into Ephesus, these houses aren't exactly as good as new, but they look phenomenal. And in many cases, of course, you deal with puzzles, trying to put the walls back together again. You see how elaborately decorated these walls were, with Corinthian pilasters as wall decoration, flanking panels, some of which are imported marble, this dark green marble probably from the Greek island of Euboea. And all of the pieces of the walls are there, but they all collapsed in an earthquake in the middle of the 3rd century AD. And so you have giant puzzle after giant puzzle after giant puzzle. You lay out all the broken wall decoration in marble, and you try to put it all back together again. Except many of these do not have figural designs. So it's a very time-consuming process. Every summer, the archaeologists go to this room, and every summer they try to put more of the puzzles back together. I wanted to mention a couple discoveries associated with the later empire, with the later 3rd and early 4th centuries AD, before including the top. The first of these focuses on Maxentius, who ruled Rome for 6 years between 306 and 312. This was the period of the Tetrarchy, where there were, in essence, 4 men who divided up the control of the Roman Empire. And many of you are familiar with the purplish porphyry groups of these tetrarchs, these 4 men who ruled the empire. The 2 most famous examples of which are in the Vatican in Rome and in St. Mark's Square in Venice. Maxentius lost his battle with Constantine in 312, and no one ever wondered what happened to the imperial insignia of Maxentius. What about his scepter? What about his ceremonial armor, which he will have had? Did that go up in smoke during the civil war between Maxentius and Constantine? Did Constantine just take it over and use it himself? What happened to it? And then a few years ago, it appeared on the Palatine Hill, at the base of the Palatine Hill, just across from the Colosseum. You see the excavation here, and then the scepter of Maxentius here, and again here, with this wonderful greenish glass orb that would have been the scepter that he would have held in his basilica in Rome. And here, one of the ceremonial spears that would undoubtedly have been held by one of his bodyguards. These have been wrapped in linen and silk and placed in a box and buried deliberately in this remote corner of the Palatine Hill. And it looks as if when Maxentius lost the battle, he still had some adherents who didn't want to see the imperial regalia of Maxentius disappear. And so they buried it in 312, and then it was found again 1,700 years later. Finally, the Arch of Constantine. And this is not a new discovery per se, but we now see it in a broader context than we used to. The Arch of Constantine is well known to all of you, I think. It's one of the most prominent monuments in ancient Rome still, right next to the Colosseum. And we were always certain that it was a statue pedestal, in a sense, for a quadriga, a 4-horse chariot of gilded bronze representing Constantine. What we had failed to grasp was the way in which that group and the arch itself linked to the colossal statue of the sun god that Nero had created during the 60s AD. So in the 60s AD, Nero builds a colossal statue of the sun god so that Rome has a kind of complement to the Colossus of Rhodes. And it's exactly the same height as the Colossus of Rhodes. A sun god with a rayed crown, a kind of radiant crown, and it reportedly had the features of Nero himself. Although those features were reportedly changed during the reign of Hadrian. As one looked at the triumphal arch then, you would have seen Constantine and the sun god in the same visual frame, in the same kind of view shed. And so as you were approaching the arch, you would have seen Constantine with the sun god literally hovering over him. It's a kind of divine inspiration. So this is not a new archaeological discovery per se, but it's an example of how much success we're now having in putting monuments into a broader context, and we're able to do that because of increasingly sophisticated three-dimensional computer modeling, examples of which you see on the screen. The best examples of this are at University of Virginia, UCLA, and now Indiana University, all of which have digital modeling laboratories, and all of which are interested in recreating elements of ancient Rome. The Roman Forum, as you see here, with the Arch of Septimius Severus, the Parthian Arch built by Augustus in 19 BC, the Roman Forum itself, and then the area around the Colosseum. When we reconstruct these areas in 3 dimensions, we think about a lot more issues than we do when we were visualizing them earlier in 2 dimensions. Crowd control, how the processions move through the streets during special ceremonies, how did the water systems work? When there were civil wars in the city, how did the fires move? A whole series of questions that we had never really articulated as fully as we should have, which we now do as a result of these computer models. And so with that, I will leave you highlighting that it's not just these computer models to which we now have access, but an increasing number of rebuilt ancient Roman structures. Cytolassos, Aphrodisias, Assos, Pergamon, all over the Roman world. When there are enough elements, usually the archaeologists have been able to find the sponsors to pay for the reconstructions of the buildings. So the buildings of ancient Rome are going up again, sometimes in actuality, sometimes only on the computer screen with advanced computer modeling. But we're acquiring a completely new understanding of ancient Rome as a consequence, as well as the ways in which ancient Rome and the modern world work together. So with that, I will end today's celebration of Rome's birthday, and thank you for coming, and of course for your support of the Penn Museum. Thank you.